A very warm welcome to the first in our series of webinars hosted by Xytal and VWV. I'm Daniel Vincent. I'm practice manager at Riles Park Medical Centre in Yeovil. I also sit on the Yeovil Primary Care Network board, and I'm a facilitator for Xytal. I'm joined today by Nikki, who is PCN manager from Paignton and Brixton PCN. Could you give us a wave, Nikki? Thank you. And also by Mark Jarvis, who is healthcare specialist at VWV. Would you mind giving us a wave? Thank you. So this series of webinars, our aspiration is to bring you up to date with the specification and really just to give you some time and space to think about your next steps, despite what's going on at the moment. So on that note, I'm going to hand you over to Nikki.
Thanks, Dan. The Primary Care Network DES was outlined in the update to the GP contract in January, and the full specification was released on the 31st of March. The climate and the pressures have changed significantly since the original specification was agreed, and it's largely gone unnoticed as primary care is taken up with responding to the COVID pandemic. There are some deadlines contained within the contract which we need to be aware of, and there may be some challenges for practices and PCNs in implementing the provisions at this time. The focus of the DES is now mainly to support practices to increase their workforce and deal with COVID-19. The service specification implementation dates have been delayed, subject to the second phase guidance which came out last week, and funding contained within the contract is protected and or repurposed to ensure stable support to practices. The first 30 or so pages of the contract relate to the organisational and participation requirements of practices and PCNs. The national deadline to confirm ongoing participation in the contract is the 31st of May. However, some CCGs have set earlier deadlines, so do check with your commissioners or the LMC. Confirmation of participation must be submitted on the national participation form contained within Annex A of the contract. Submission of the participation form is also confirmation by each practice that they intend to participate in this year and subsequent years' PCN DES contracts up until March 2024. There is an opt-out process for practices in exceptional circumstances, and the details for this are contained at paragraph 4.14 of the contract. For PCNs that were previously approved and have no changes, the confirmation is straightforward. Practice leaders should discuss together continued participation and arrange for submission of the declaration. It's hopefully an easy conversation and could be had by email, but it does depend on the relationship of the PCN practices. Those PCNs just need to complete tab 5 of the declaration, indicating no changes, and then complete the details from row 19 onwards, send it off to the commissioners. Where a previously non-participating practice is joining a previously approved PCN, or a new practice is joining a previously approved PCN, the practice and the PCN will need to take some additional steps, namely, agree and sign an updated network agreement, confirm the nominated payee, and complete tabs 2 and 5 of the participation form. If a new PCN is being formed, they need to complete tab 3 of the participation form. If a new PCN is being formed, they need to complete tab 3 of the participation form, along with practice details, practice list size, a map of the PCN area, a copy of the network agreement, and tab 5 of the participation form. And doing all of that before the 31st of May, during COVID, is quite a big ask. If work hasn't started on these things yet, the PCN may want to talk to the commissioners about an extension. Now, there might be some practices out there who wish to sign up to the contract who are not part of the PCN. They should complete tabs 4 and 5 of the participation form. The commissioner may require that practice join an existing PCN and require the PCN to accept them, but this should be a facilitative conversation and can involve the LMC. Next slide, please. Commissioners will consider the participation form and any other information submitted, and within 1 month of submission, notify practices as to whether or not their participation in the contract is confirmed. This means nationally, by the 30th of June, all practices should have been notified, unless you've had an extension. Where participation is confirmed, all practices in the PCN must, as soon as possible, enter into a written variation of its primary medical services contract to incorporate the DES contract provisions, and indicate on CQRS that the practice is participating in the DES contract, and ensure that the PCN network agreement reflects arrangements for the delivery of contract services. If participation is not confirmed, the Commissioner will notify the practices and explain their reasons for the decision. There should then be a facilitative conversation with all parties, which again can include the LMC, to enable confirmation to happen as soon as possible. It all sounds really simple and straightforward, but for any other option other than no changes, there are contracting and relationship challenges to be addressed by the deadline. And for those, I'll hand you over to Mark.
Thank you. So as a quick recap, the network agreement is the PCN's governance documentation. It consists of a model agreement published by NHS England last March, and it is mandatory, which means it cannot be varied by the practices, save where the agreement expressly permits. It's the schedules to the agreement which were for PCNs to locally populate. Now, last year, there was a mad rush to get the schedules finalized. There will be PCNs out there who perhaps relied on templates, didn't adapt them, or didn't have time to finish properly completing them. Our message last year was to ensure that the schedules were robust and fit for purpose. And that same message is true this year. Now, one of the many consequences of COVID lockdown is I needed to buy a new pair of trousers, but I can't go out and try them on. And ordering online without having tried them on and not taking account of the fact that working from home puts me in very close proximity to the biscuit tin meant that I put on a few more pounds than expected. And it's not surprising that my new trousers didn't fit my new shape. And the same is going to be true of your PCN schedules. It's important that they are tailored to reflect how they operate, particularly given the passage of time and the changes to the DES specification. Like my trousers, you need to make sure your PCN schedules still fit. Particularly important this year as PCNs are moving into full service provision, and NHS England have made it clear that each practice is individually and jointly responsible for the delivery of the DES, with potential for breach notices for all. So it's particularly important to ensure that the schedules contain appropriate indemnities between the practices with regard to fault. In particular then, perhaps need to focus on the Schedule 3 of the network agreement, which relates to the activities of the individual practices. You need to consider whether the individual practices' responsibilities or activities have been clearly defined and can be monitored, and any performance or remedial issues actioned. We have advised that the Schedule 3 annex could be separated from the network agreement as a separate annex, which makes it easier to update mid-year rather than having to agree variations to your network agreement every time you want to update that. Other schedules which are worth revisiting include Schedules 4 and 5 in relation to payment and workforce arrangements. Again, you need to query whether there have been any changes in the way you operate, and therefore do the schedules need to be updated to reflect that. Perhaps less importantly, but still important, Schedule 7, which details the arrangements with third parties. Particularly moving into Year 2, it's quite likely that involvements with third parties may have changed, and those should be updated. Partnership deeds. The messages regarding updating the PCN agreements is also true of partnership agreements, and the link here to the network DES is it's so important when working together collaboratively to have a strong foundation. And rather like where the practice is involved in a GP federation, the partnership agreement should make clear that the individual partner is perhaps holding a share on trust with the other partners. So consider whether your partnership agreement has the necessary provisions. Does it set out the role and responsibility of a representative in the PCN? And does it provide them with an appropriate indemnity where they incur potential liability? Also need to think about the potential of a leaving partner and making clear that they're not entitled to any potential share of surplus in the PCN, and indeed any assets it may hold. I mentioned earlier about non-core practice members. Moving into Year 2, you need to consider whether or not the PCN agreement needs to be adapted to include members who are non-core who are not core network practices. The PCN agreement uses the term members, which is a collective term for all of the parties. But it's quite likely that in year one, a lot of the provisions which relate to core network practices will need to be separated from those which would relate not to the non-core network practices, particularly regarding decision making and voting. Finally, we would suggest that it's very important to take the advice of a specialist medical accountant in your schedules, particularly in relation to the finance schedules. There are a number of VAT specialists out there advising on the potential of the application of cost sharing groups to PCNs. And we would certainly suggest advice is taken from specialist accountants regarding potential options. Now, if you're thinking of setting up a PCN company, perhaps in relation to setting up a cost sharing group, it is important to take accountancy advice. The legal perspective, of course, perhaps is ensuring that your corporate governance, i.e. your shareholders' agreements, reflects, where appropriate, the PCN agreement regarding decision making and how shares are held and how surplus is distributed. We have this second slide, please. I mentioned earlier that the network agreement allowed some flexibility in relation to local adaptation of the mandated term. This is really to put flesh on the bones or, where permitted, to substitute alternative arrangements. Now, you need to consider how the new specification might change that. And as a particularly strong example, it's worth noting that the network agreement currently allows for a voluntary departure of a practice when giving 6 months' notice. But we now know that the door is being closed on that under the new specification. The new arrangements have auto enrolment in the next year's DES and a very limited mid-year exit, by which I mean a practice can only live mid-year following a change or variation to the specification by NHS England, and only if that practice gives notice within 1 month of that particular variation being published. Other than that, practice can only leave at year end, and again within 1 month of the new DES specification being published. Otherwise, they'll be auto-enrolled into the second year. Now, that arrangement regarding voluntary departure is currently, as set out in the specification, currently conflicts with clause 65 and voluntary departure. The specification places an obligation on the PCN to update the PCN agreement to reflect the new specification. You're not allowed to amend the mandatory terms of the network agreement. Now, one might consider NHS England will publish a national variation to update the network agreement. Nothing's been published yet, which isn't helpful, and perhaps is par for the course. Now, we will keep an eye out for any publication and send that out to our healthcare list, but do be mindful that the goalposts may be shifting later on this month. So do be mindful what your schedules say on voluntary exit. You may need to adapt that. Also, if you've included provisions on probation, you may need to tie that into expulsion to be absolutely clear. One other important point of the DES specification is that this year, the CCG can require a PCN to accept a practice. Now, that will be tempered by the usual discussions and the involvement of the LMC. But the specification makes it very clear that the CCG can determine that a PCN accepts a practice. Why is that important for the network agreement? Well, it's quite likely you will have provisions in there relating to joining practices. That is very much likely now to be more of a preparation event rather than an approval event. Thank you for listening. I'm going to pass you back to Dan.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much, both of you. Just before we let people know what we're up to next week, I wonder whether you had sort of 3 take-homes, 3 actions that people need to really be focusing on over the next week. Nikki, could we start with you?
Sure. Make sure you know what the deadline date is for your area, whether there's a local date or whether it's the national date. Make sure that you've downloaded the participation form and you know which tabs you need to complete, and get that form into your commissioners.
Brilliant, thank you. And Mark?
My 3 takeaways would be to make sure your schedules are up to date and they reflect how you operate. Take advice from a specialist medical accountants where appropriate, and if in doubt, ask for help.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much for joining us today. We will be back next week on Wednesday, the 13th of May, where we will be talking about the new additional roles where there have been a significant number of changes. So please join us then. Look forward to seeing you. Take care. Bye.